A quiet widower bought an old piano at an estate sale, but when he found the hidden compartment, he couldn't sleep for weeks. Burl Hensley spotted the Steinway upright through the parlor window of the Talcott farmhouse on Quarry Hill Road, driving past on his way to the hardware store. He knew from the road what it was: scratched case, veneer lifting, but the proportions of a serious instrument. He came back on Saturday for the estate sale and paid $200 cash. The neighbor's boy Kevin helped him load it into the Ford pickup. Strong kid, but careless, had to be told twice to watch the legs. Burl drove home at 20 miles an hour, talking to the piano as he talked to all of them. Easy now, almost there. Burl Hensley was 61 years old, a widower, a piano restorer, a man who had played organ at Millbrook Congregational for 23 years before leaving over a hymnal dispute that everyone else had forgotten and he had not. His wife Ellen had been gone 7 years. Cancer, the quick kind, gone before you finish understanding what the doctor said. He lived alone in a cottage on Mill Creek Road, with 3 half-restored pianos in the carriage house and a kitchen full of silence. He was not a man who went looking for trouble. He went to estate sales looking for instruments. He tuned every pin by ear and never rushed, because rushing was just another word for doing it wrong. That evening, in his workshop, he began the teardown. Fall board off, action assembly out, hammers pulled. Then he looked at the bottom board, a 1/4 inch higher than factory spec. He tapped it with his knuckle. Hollow. He worked a flathead screwdriver along the seam, and the false bottom popped free. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in brown oilcloth and tied with kitchen string. His hands were steady. Something in his chest was not. He cut the string with his pocket knife and unrolled the cloth. Church donation receipts, dozens, brittle, dated 1961 through 1995, each stamped Millbrook Congregational Church, Africa Mission Fund. A black composition notebook with 2 columns on every page, amounts collected on the left, amounts sent on the right. The left was always larger. The gap widened year by year, like a crack in a foundation. A typed letter on thin airmail paper from the West Africa Evangelical Mission Board, Accra, Ghana, dated March 12, 1978. We have no record of any donations received from your church. And at the bottom, a single sheet of lined paper in a shaking script. No signature, no date, just one sentence. I have counted what we gave and what you sent, and the numbers do not match. Burl read it 3 more times, holding the paper close because his reading glasses were inside the house and he was not ready to leave the workshop yet. The fluorescent light hummed above him. A mouse scratched somewhere behind the baseboard. The Steinway stood open and gutted on the floor, like a patient on an operating table. He went back to the receipts. Each one bore the name of a family in the neat script of a careful bookkeeper. The Devanes, the Stanhopes, the Bernies, the Murdocks. Names he knew. He knew whose piano this was. The Talcott farmhouse had belonged to the Hubbard family for decades. A summer property, passed down through the generations. This Steinway had sat in Pastor Wendell Hubbard's parlor, the man who led Millbrook Congregational for 37 years. The man half the county still called a saint. Burl had sat in the front pew as church organist while Hubbard preached. He had watched the man lay hands on the sick and weep with the grieving, and stand at the door after every service, shaking hands with a grip that made you believe you were the only person in the room who mattered. And now Burl was holding proof that the man had been stealing from those same people the whole time. He picked up the composition notebook again and flipped to the middle, somewhere in the late 1970s, when the numbers were already bad and getting worse. The left column showed a Sunday collection of $412 for the Africa Mission. The right column showed $100 wired. $312 gone, just from one Sunday. One collection. One lie told from one pulpit. Burl stared at the receipts, the notebook, the airmail letter. He read the unsigned note again. Then again. His hands finally began to tremble. He remembered Ellen's voice on the porch that September before she died, the maples just starting to turn. "You're the most stubborn man I ever loved," she had said, laughing a little, shaking her head. "You find one wrong note in a whole hymn and you can't let it go. You just sit there until every single one is right." He had laughed too, back then. Now, in the workshop, with the dust of 40 years on his fingers, he did not laugh. He had found the wrong note. And it was not one. Morning came slow and gray in late October in Connecticut, thin light through windows that need washing, the smell of frost on the fields outside. Burl had not slept. He carried the documents from the workshop to the kitchen table and spread them out under the overhead lamp with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments before cutting. The composition notebook was the key to everything. He started at the first page, September 1961, and worked forward. Each Sunday had its own line. Left column, total collected for the Africa Mission Fund. Right column, amount Pastor Hubbard claimed to have wired overseas. The first year, the gap was small. $40 here, $60 there. A difference a man could explain away with postage fees, wire charges, administrative costs. But by 1970, the gap was hundreds per quarter. By the 80s, thousands per year. Burl got a pencil and a pad of paper from the kitchen drawer. He added columns the way he tuned octaves, slow, checking each number twice. By the time he had worked through all 34 years of entries, the sum made his stomach turn. More than $400,000 collected from the congregation had never left Litchfield County. $400,000 in crumpled 5s and 10s and 20s, folded into offering plates by families who thought they were feeding children in West Africa. He picked up the airmail letter from Ghana again, 1978. The mission board had written to ask why no money had arrived, and someone, Burl guessed Hubbard himself, had kept the letter instead of answering it. Tucked it into the piano's belly like a confession he could not bring himself to destroy. The receipts confirmed the collection totals. Every one bore the Tricia stamp and the treasurer's initials. And the treasurer, Burl recalled, was Mildred Hubbard, the pastor's wife. She had kept the books for 40 years. She knew. She had to have known. Burl turned that fact over in his mind. Why keep the ledger at all? A smart thief destroys the evidence. But then he thought about Mildred, her signature on every receipt, her initials on every deposit slip. If Mildred ever turned on her husband, if she ever threatened to talk, that notebook was Wendell's proof that she was neck-deep in it too. Insurance. A husband holding a loaded gun under the family table pointed at his own wife. And after Mildred died in '93, 2 years before the last entry in the notebook, Wendell must have moved the whole bundle into the piano. Not because he wanted it found, because old men cannot throw away the instruments of their power, even when the power is gone. But where did the money go? Burl found the answer between the notebook's last pages, pressed flat like dried flowers. 6 photographs, each one showing a rural property. Fields, stone walls, a barn, a tree line. On the back of each photograph, in Pastor Hubbard's neat block print, the acreage, the purchase price, the date, and the buyer's name. None of the names were Hubbard. Warren Schofield, G. Raymond Thatch, Dolores Metcalf. Names Burl had never heard in 40 years of living in this county. Shell buyers, straw purchasers. People paid to put their names on deeds so the pastors never appeared. Burl got up from the table and went to the hall closet. On the top shelf, behind a box of Ellen's winter scarves he could not bring himself to give away, he found his old Litchfield County Road Atlas. He brought it to the kitchen and began matching the parcel descriptions on the photographs to actual locations. The first 2 parcels were up near Norfolk, hill land, mostly timber. The third was south of Goshen near a reservoir. But the last 3 made him set down his pencil and press both hands flat on the table. All 3 bordered the old Murdoch dairy farm. Burl knew that farm. It belonged to the landscape of his life, the way certain hymns belong to his fingers. Part of him, unremarkable until someone took it away. White farmhouse with a green metal roof. 87 acres of rolling pasture running down to Whippoorwill Creek. Clayton Murdoch had run 60 head of Holsteins there, rising at 4 every morning, milking by hand until he could finally afford a bulk tank in '79. Burl had sat 2 pews behind Clayton every Sunday for 20 years. Watched the man reach into his coat pocket, pull out a folded envelope, and place it in the collection plate with the quiet dignity of a person who believed what he was doing mattered. Clayton lost the farm in '87. The creditors came. The cows were auctioned. Clayton and Agnes moved into a rented house on Maple Street, and Clayton never stood quite as straight after that. He died in '94 of a heart attack in the parking lot of the hardware store, and people said he had never been the same since losing the land. Now Burl was staring at proof that Pastor Hubbard had taken Clayton's tithe money and used it to buy the land around Clayton's farm. 3 parcels, purchased through straw buyers between 1972 and 1986, forming a ring around the Murdoch property. Once those parcels were consolidated under the Hubbard Trust, the Murdoch farm became landlocked. No access to the county road without crossing trust land, no way to expand, no buffer against rising costs. The foreclosure was not bad luck, it was arithmetic. Burl brewed a second pot of coffee. Filter, grounds, water. Motions his body knew while his mind worked through what he was looking at. He had played organ at this man's church for 23 years. He had shaken this man's hand at the door after services. He had listened to this man pray for the poor and the hungry and the children of Africa. He sat back down and picked up the unsigned letter again. That shaking handwriting, those careful, deliberate words. I have counted what we gave and what you sent, and the numbers do not match. Was this Clayton? Had he suspected the truth before he died? Had he written this letter, addressed it to the pastor, and then, what, lost his nerve? Been talked out of it? Simply set it aside because no one would believe a failed dairy farmer over a beloved man of God? Funny how the truth works. It does not need a voice. It just needs a place to hide until somebody comes along stubborn enough to look. Dawn was breaking outside the kitchen window. Burl realized he had been sitting in the same chair for 9 hours. His coffee was cold. The notebook lay open to the last page, where the final entry read simply, December 24, 1995. Collected $840. Sent 0. Christmas Eve. The man had stolen the Christmas Eve offering, every penny of it. Burl closed the notebook. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink, slow and thorough, as he always did after handling something old and fragile. Then he dried them on the towel Ellen had embroidered with small blue birds, the one he still kept hanging by the stove, because taking it down would mean she was really gone. He stood at the window. The fields across the road were white with frost. The stone walls ran through them like old sentences, marking boundaries that meant something once. He had a dead pastor, a stolen fortune, a ruined family, and a pile of proof that nobody had asked for. Well then, he guessed he had some thinking to do. The Litchfield County Land Records Office sat in the basement of the old courthouse on West Street, a stone building from 1847 that smelled of paper and floor wax and the slow patience of bureaucracy. Burl parked his Ford out front and walked in at 9 sharp, carrying a legal pad with the 6 parcel descriptions copied in his careful handwriting. The clerk behind the counter was a woman named Darla Spence, about 50, with reading glasses on a chain, and the manner of someone who had answered the same questions for 20 years and did not mind answering them again. Burl told her he needed deed histories for 6 specific parcels, and she pulled out a request form without a word. While Darla worked the records, Burl sat in a wooden chair against the wall. The last time he had been inside this building was 2019, the year he came down to file Ellen's death certificate. He remembered the same chair, the document in his lap, reading it 3 times as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less permanent if he just kept looking. They did not. Darla came back with a stack of folders 20 minutes later. "These go back to the 1800s for most of them," she said. "You want the whole history or just recent transfers?" "All of it." Burl took the folders to the reading table by the window. He took the folders to the reading table by the window and began. The records confirmed what the notebook suggested, piece by piece. Each of the 6 parcels had been purchased between 1968 and 1992 by individuals, the same names from the photograph backs, who then transferred ownership within 2 to 5 years to a family trust. The trust's name was printed clearly on every transfer deed: Hubbard Heritage Land Trust. Established June 14, 1967. Sole trustee, Wendell R. Hubbard. There it was. Written in county ink, on county paper, filed in county records, sitting in a county basement for decades, where anyone could have found it, if anyone had thought to look. Burl had bought a disposable camera at the pharmacy on his way downtown, the kind with 27 exposures and a built-in flash. He photographed every page, every deed, every transfer document, every signature. The flash lit up the reading room like small bolts of lightning, and Darla looked over but said nothing. He was on his way out, folders returned, camera in his jacket pocket, when he came around the corner of the lobby and nearly walked straight into Trenton Hubbard. The man was tall, lean, dressed in khaki pants and a blue blazer, and leather shoes that cost more than a working man's boots, but not so much that anyone would comment. He carried a leather briefcase and had the look of someone who owned the ground he stood on. Trenton stopped mid-stride, his eyebrows lifting a fraction. "Burl Hensley. Well, I haven't seen you since Granddad's memorial service. What brings you to the records office?" Burl felt his hand tighten on the legal pad at his side. "Just checking my property lines. Neighbor's been talking about putting up a fence." It was a clumsy lie, and both of them knew it. Trenton's eyes moved to the folder Burl was carrying, a manila folder he had brought from home to hold his notes, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not alarm. Something more careful. A dog's ears going flat before you hear the thunder. Trenton smiled in a way that did not quite reach his eyes. "Well, good to see you. You take care now." Burl nodded and walked past him to the door. The autumn air hit his face, and he realized he was sweating. He drove home the long way, through Goshen and down Route 63, past the farms and the white churches and the stone walls that stitched the landscape together like sutures in old skin. Trenton's face kept surfacing in his mind. That flicker of recognition. The gaze landing on the folder and staying there a beat too long. At home, he put the camera in the kitchen drawer and sat down to eat a bowl of soup he did not taste. The phone rang at 6:14 that evening. "Burl, it's Trenton Hubbard." The voice was warm, practiced, neighborly. "Listen, I heard through the grapevine you bought that old Steinway from the Talcott sale last week. Beautiful instrument. My grandfather used to play it, you know. Hymns, mostly. It's got a lot of sentimental value for the family. I was wondering if you might consider selling it back to us.
I pay you well. Name your price. Burl leaned against the kitchen counter. Outside the window, the last daylight was draining from the hills. I appreciate the offer, but I'm restoring it. It's not for sale. Trenton's voice stayed smooth, practiced. I understand, but I'm serious about the sentimental value. How about $1,000?
5 times what you paid.
It's not about the money, Trenton. A pause with weight to it.
Trenton let out a slow breath. 5,000. For a piano you paid 200 for. That's a generous offer, Burl. Most folks would take it. I guess I'm not most folks. Another pause, longer this time. When Trenton spoke again, the warmth was gone. What replaced it was not exactly a threat. It was the absence of friendliness, which, in a small town, amounts to the same thing. Think about it. I'll call you tomorrow. Burl pressed the receiver tighter against his ear. You don't need to do that. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen, listening to the silence that follows when you know something has started that will not stop on its own. The phone rang again 10 minutes later. He looked at it, let it ring 7 times, and did not answer. He walked out to the workshop instead. The Steinway sat where he had left it, open and exposed, the false bottom leaning against the wall. He ran his hand along the soundboard. Spruce, old growth, tight grain. Wood they do not make anymore because the trees are gone. He remembered something Ellen used to say when one of his restorations hit a snag, a cracked plate, a warped pin block, a problem that made the whole project uncertain. She would stand in the workshop doorway with her arms crossed and say, "So what are you going to do, Burl? Quit or figure it out?" She always knew the answer before she asked. He covered the Steinway with a drop cloth, turned off the workshop lights, and went inside to make a list of what he needed to do next. At the top, he wrote, "Find out who wrote the unsigned letter." He drove to the church on a Tuesday morning, a cold gray November day when the trees are bare and the sky presses down on the hills like a lid on a pot.
Millbrook Congregational stood at the crossroads of routes 63 and 118, a white clapboard building with a steeple that had been pointing at heaven since 1821. Burl had played its organ for 23 years. He knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft from the windows, how the light came through the east-facing glass on Easter morning and turned the whole sanctuary gold. Reverend Dale Osterhaus met him in the vestry, a small room behind the sanctuary where the deacons kept their minutes and the communion silver gathered tarnish between Sundays. Osterhaus was a mild man in his mid-50s with a soft handshake and careful eyes. He had taken over the pulpit in 2003, 5 years after Pastor Hubbard died, and he had spent his ministry tending a congregation that still spoke of his predecessor with a mixture of awe and gratitude, like people recalling weather they survived. Burl laid it all out on the vestry table, the ledger, the receipts, the airmail letter from Ghana, the photographs, the land trust records from the county office. He talked the way he worked, slowly, methodically, letting each piece of evidence take its weight before moving on to the next. Osterhaus listened without interrupting. His face went from puzzled to pale, to something beyond pale, a color Burl had only seen on men receiving very bad news in hospital rooms. When Burl finished, the Reverend sat with his hands folded on the table for a long time, staring at the composition notebook as though it might catch fire and save him from having to respond. "This is," Osterhaus began, then stopped. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "This is devastating, Burl. If this is true..." Burl tapped the composition notebook with one finger. "It's true. The numbers are right there." "I believe you. I do. But you have to understand, this is not a matter for one man to carry. This is a church matter, a congregation matter. I need to bring this to the Board of Elders." "And then what?" "And then they decide.
That's how it works, Burl. That's how it has always worked. Burl wanted to say that how it had always worked was precisely the problem, that the board had looked the other way for 30 years while a man robbed them blind. But he held his tongue. He had brought the evidence to the church. He owed the church the chance to respond. "How long?" he asked. "Give me a week. I'll call an emergency board meeting." Burl nodded. He gathered the documents, left copies of the key pages with Osterhaus, and drove home. A week passed, then 8 days, then 9. On the 10th day, the phone rang. "Burl, it's Dale Osterhaus." The Reverend's voice had the careful flatness of a man reading from a prepared statement. "The board met last Thursday evening. They reviewed the materials you provided and discussed the matter at length." "And?" "The board's position is that the documents are historical in nature.
The individual in question is deceased. The families involved have, in many cases, moved on. The board feels that public disclosure at this time would cause significant harm to the congregation and to the church's ministry in the community." Burl closed his eyes. "What does that mean, Dale, in plain English?" A pause. "They want you to turn over the original documents to the board for safekeeping, and they want the matter to rest." Safekeeping. The word tasted like ashes. "I know how this sounds. Do they plan to contact the families, the ones who were cheated?" The silence on the other end of the line was the loudest thing Burl had heard since Ellen's last breath. "The board feels," Osterhaus said slowly, "that reopening old wounds would cause more harm than good." Burl thanked him for calling and hung up. He sat in his kitchen for a long time, watching the shadows of the bare maple branches move across the floor as the wind blew outside. Then he put on his coat and drove to the church. It was after 9 in the evening. The building was dark. The parking lot was empty except for Burl's Ford. He used the side door, the one by the choir room, and the old lock turned the same way it always had, because small-town churches change their locks about as often as they change their theology, which is to say, almost never. The sanctuary was dark except for the faint glow of the exit signs. Burl walked down the center aisle between the pews, his boots quiet on the carpet, the smell of old wood and lemon oil and candle wax filling his lungs as it had 1,000 times before. He sat in Clayton Murdoch's pew, 3rd row, left side, near the aisle. The wood was smooth and worn from a century of Sunday worship. Burl rested his hands on his knees and looked up at the pulpit where Wendell Hubbard had stood every week for 37 years, smiling that warm smile, speaking in that deep, measured voice, thanking the congregation for their generosity, telling them their money was feeding children, building schools, bringing the Word of God to a continent that needed it. And then driving to a lawyer's office to buy another piece of land. Agnes Murdoch was 84 now, living at Briarwood because there was nowhere else for her to go. Clayton at the kitchen table on Saturday night, counting bills, setting aside the tithe before he paid his own, because that was what a faithful man did. Ellen. Not a specific memory, just her presence, arriving in dark rooms, not a ghost, nothing so dramatic, just a feeling, like standing near a stove that had been turned off but still held the heat. Burl stood up, walked to the organ.
The console was dusty. Osterhaus had hired a woman from Torrington to play after Burl left, and she apparently was not much for maintenance. He sat on the bench, turned on the power, pulled out a single stop, the great diapason, the foundation voice, and pressed 3 keys. A C major chord filled the empty church, deep, full, resonant. It rolled through the sanctuary and up into the steeple, and faded slowly into the silence of a building that had kept secrets for longer than anyone knew. Burl released the keys, pushed in the stop, turned off the power, closed the fall board. He would not come back here. He was done trusting institutions. He walked out the side door, pulled it shut behind him and stood in the cold parking lot under a sky full of stars. He looked up at the stars. "Well, Ellen, I guess I'm figuring it out."
The Briarwood Assisted Living Facility sat on a rise above Route 202, a low brick building from the 70s with aluminum window frames and a parking lot that needed repaving. Burl parked his Ford between a GMC Sierra with a handicap plate and a Chevy Malibu that had seen better days. He signed in at the front desk, told the nurse he was there to visit Agnes Murdoch, and followed the hallway to the sunroom. Agnes sat in a wheelchair by the window, though what the window showed her now was anyone's guess. Macular degeneration had taken most of her sight over the last 5 years, leaving her a world of shapes and shadows and the memory of what things used to look like. She was small. She had always been small, Burl remembered, even when she was young and strong enough to haul milk cans. And her white hair was pinned back neatly, and her hands rested in her lap with the patience of someone waiting for something she had been promised a long time ago. He pulled a chair beside her. "Agnes, it's Burl Hensley, from church." Her face turned toward his voice, and a small smile appeared. "Burl? Oh my, I haven't heard your name in ages. How's Ellen?" A quick ache, like stepping on a nail. "Ellen passed, Agnes, 7 years ago." Oh, that's right. I'm sorry, Burl. My memory's not what it was." She reached out and found his hand and squeezed it. Her grip was stronger than he expected. "You played the organ so beautifully. Clayton always said you were the best organist Millbrook ever had." "That's kind of him." "He loved that church," Agnes said. Her voice turned inward, toward rooms no one else can enter. "Every Sunday, rain or shine, he'd be up at 5, even when the cows were already milked, just to make sure his suit was pressed and his shoes were shined. He said if you were going to stand before God, you ought to look like you meant it." Burl listened. He had not come to talk. He had come to listen and to understand what had been taken from this woman and her husband, and to decide how much truth she could bear. "He gave everything he could to that mission fund," Agnes continued. "Sometimes more than we could afford, if I'm honest. I'd say, 'Clayton, we need that for the feed bill.' And he'd say, 'Agnes, those children need it more than our cows do.'" She laughed softly. "Stubborn man. Good man, but stubborn." "Did he ever talk about the mission itself? Did you ever hear from the people in Africa?" Agnes shook her head slowly. "Pastor Hubbard would give reports sometimes, from the pulpit. He'd read letters, said they were from the mission workers over there. Children being baptized, schools being built. Clayton ate that up. Made him feel like he was part of something bigger than a dairy farm in Connecticut." Burl held her hand and said nothing about what he knew. Not yet.
He could not look into this woman's clouded eyes and tell her that her husband's life of sacrifice had been stolen by a man she trusted. Not until he had something to offer besides the truth. The truth by itself was just a wound. He needed the cure to go with it. Burl squeezed her fingers gently when she grew tired. "Thank you, Agnes. I'll come back and visit again." Agnes patted his hand. "You bring your organ music. Play something for me next time. Clayton would like that." He drove home in silence, the heater rattling in the dashboard, the bare trees along the road standing like witnesses who refused to testify. 2 days later, the letter arrived. It came in a heavy cream envelope with the return address of Hubbard and Associates, attorneys at law, printed in raised lettering. But it was not signed by Trenton. It was signed by a man named Gerald K. Prescott, Esquire, a Hartford litigation attorney whose letterhead listed offices on Asylum Street and a string of bar admissions. Trenton had hired outside counsel. The letter was typed on Prescott's stationery, 3 pages, single-spaced. It cited property law, estate law, the Connecticut Uniform Trade Secrets Act, and something called right of first refusal pertaining to family heirlooms. It demanded the return of all materials, documents, and objects found within the Steinway upright piano within 72 hours. It threatened legal action for possession of private family documents obtained without authorization from a family estate sale. It noted that Prescott's firm was prepared to seek an emergency restraining order and that any further dissemination of the documents would constitute tortious interference with the Hubbard family's estate proceedings. The second page listed specific penalties. The third page was a formal cease and desist requiring Burrell's signature and notarization, promising he would make no copies and speak to no one about the contents of the piano. Burrell read it 3 times. The legal language was thick, but the meaning was thin. Give it back, shut your mouth, or a Hartford law firm will bury you in motions until you cannot afford to fight. The next afternoon, Prescott himself showed up. A black Audi pulled into the driveway, and a man in a charcoal overcoat stepped out. Mid-50s, silver hair cropped close, the posture of someone who billed $400 an hour and wanted you to know it. He knocked on the front door and held up a business card when Burrell opened it. "Mr. Hensley, Gerald Prescott, I represent the Hubbard family." He did not offer his hand. "I wanted to deliver a courtesy. The 72-hour window in my letter expires tomorrow at noon. After that, we file. Emergency motion for return of property, temporary restraining order, and a defamation claim. My client is prepared to pursue this to the fullest extent." He paused, letting the words settle like dust. "You're a piano tuner, Mr. Hensley. I don't say that to be unkind. I say it because litigation is expensive, and the Hubbard family has resources you do not. This doesn't have to be unpleasant." Burrell leaned against the doorframe. He looked at the business card, then at the man holding it. "You drove 2 hours from Hartford to tell me that?" "I drove 2 hours to save you from a very costly mistake." "Then you wasted your gas." Burrell closed the door. He stood in the hallway and listened to the Audi back out of the driveway, the tires crunching slow on the gravel, and then the silence that followed. He walked out to the workshop, opened the Steinway's case, and placed Prescott's letter inside, right next to the oilcloth bundle. He patted the rim. "Keep each other company." The next morning he put on clean clothes and drove his Ford to the Litchfield County District Attorney's office in a building on Main Street that used to be a bank. The receptionist, a young woman with a polite smile and a telephone that would not stop ringing, told him the DA was in Hartford for the week attending a conference. "Can I leave a message?" Burrell asked. "Of course." She handed him a slip of paper. He wrote, "Burrell Hensley, Mill Creek Road, possible fraud case involving deceased individual and family land trust. 30+ years. Have documentation." He left his phone number and walked out. On the drive home, he took Route 63 south through the center of the county. The road dipped through a valley where the Whippoorwill Creek ran through meadows that used to be pasture and were now turning back to brush and young maple. He came around a curve, and there it was. The Murdoch farm, or what was left of it. The white farmhouse still stood, but the paint had peeled down to gray wood and the front porch was sagging. The barn roof had caved in on the north side, the beams hanging down like broken ribs.
The fields were waist-high with goldenrod and milkweed and scrub that moves in when nobody mows. The fences were down. The bulk tank Clayton had been so proud of sat rusting beside the barn like a monument to something that failed. And at the gate, wired to the fence post, a metal sign. Hubbard Heritage Land Trust. No trespassing. Burrell pulled his truck to the shoulder and killed the engine. He sat there for a long time looking at that sign. Green letters on white, neat and official. A sign a lawyer orders from a catalog. It told you who owned the land now. It did not tell you how they got it. Clayton Murdoch standing in this same spot, watching the auctioneer sell his cows one by one. Agnes packing boxes in the kitchen. The pastor in his study, adding another column of figures to his secret notebook, the numbers growing like a cancer no one could see. Burrell started the truck. He was done waiting, done leaving messages, done hoping someone else would do what needed doing. He drove home and pulled the old church directory from the drawer in the hall table, the one he had kept from his last year as organist, 1999.
It was spiral-bound, with the church's name and a drawing of the steeple on the cover. Inside, every member family was listed with their address and phone number. He sat at the kitchen table and began making calls. On a Thursday evening in the second week of November, 11 people gathered in Burl Hensley's carriage house workshop. They came in trucks and old sedans, parking along Mill Creek Road with their headlights cutting through the dark, brief, purposeful, then gone. The temperature was dropping and you could smell snow coming, that particular sharpness in the air that Connecticut people recognize as surely as their own names. Burl had set up folding chairs and overturned apple crates in a rough semicircle.
He had cleared the half-restored uprights to the walls and hung the trouble light from the ceiling beam to give the room a hard, honest brightness that left nowhere to hide. On a sheet of plywood balanced across two sawhorses, he had laid out every document in the order he planned to present them. The Steinway stood at the center of the room, its case open, the false bottom leaning against it like a door ripped off its hinges. The 11 who came were the sons and daughters and surviving spouses of families who had tithed to Pastor Hubbard's Africa Mission Fund. Martha Devane, 71, whose father had given for 25 years. Roy and Linda Stanhope, whose parents lost a haylot on Chestnut Hill Road. Ed Burney, 68, a retired mailman whose mother had put $5 in the plate every Sunday for 3 decades. Helen Goss, whose husband had died believing their donations were building the school outside Accra. And others, quiet people in work jackets and sensible shoes, people whose faces Burl had known from the pews for decades, and who had come tonight because Burl Hensley had called and said he had something they needed to see. He did not make a speech. He started the way he started every restoration, with the instrument itself. "This piano belonged to Pastor Wendell Hubbard," he said, placing his hand on the Steinway's rim. "I bought it at the Talcott estate sale for $200. When I opened it up to do the restoration, I found a false bottom in the case. Inside was this." He held up the oilcloth bundle. Then, piece by piece, he walked them through it. The composition notebook. He opened it to a page from 1974 and turned it so they could see the 2 columns. "Left side is what he collected," he tapped the right column. "And this is what he claimed to send. You can see the difference." The church receipts. He fanned them out on the plywood. "These are your parents' donations, your family's money. Every one stamped and initialed by the church treasurer, who was Mildred Hubbard." The airmail letter from the West Africa Evangelical Mission Board. He read it aloud, slowly, the way you read scripture. "We have no record of any donations received from your church. Please verify your records." The land trust documents from the county office. He unfolded a hand-drawn map he had made, the parcel boundaries outlined in red pencil, the names of the straw buyers written in the margins. 3 families in the room saw their own lost land inside those red lines. The room went silent, the deep silence that follows something breaking before anyone knows what sound it will make. Martha Devane sat in the front row with her hands in her lap, staring at the ledger. Tears ran down her face, not dramatic, not accompanied by sobs, just water moving down skin, steady, and beyond anyone's control. Ed Burney took off his cap and held it in both hands. "How much? How much did he take?" "Best I can figure, over $400,000 across 34 years. Burl let the number settle. The number sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water. You could feel it spreading. Then Burl took out the last piece. The single sheet of lined paper. The unsigned, unsent letter in that shaking handwriting. He held it up so they could see it, then read it aloud. "I have counted what we gave and what you sent, and the numbers do not match." Helen Goss let out a small sound, not a word, just a breath, as though something had been pressing on her chest for years and had finally shifted enough to let air through. "I believe this was written by Clayton Murdoch," Burl said. "I can't prove it yet, but the handwriting looks like a man I remember, and Clayton was the kind of man who would count." He let the silence hold. These people had earned their silence. It was 30 years deep.
Then the workshop door opened, and the cold night air came in, and with it came Trenton Hubbard. He stood in the doorway, his briefcase in one hand, his face the color of candle wax. His breath made small clouds in the cold. Someone in the room, Roy Stanhope maybe, muttered something under his breath. Burl set the unsigned letter down on the plywood and faced the door. "This is private property, Trenton, but you're welcome to come in." Trenton stepped inside and closed the door behind him. His eyes moved over the room, the folding chairs, the faces, the plywood table with its load of evidence, the open piano with its secret cavity on display. He looked like a man walking into his own trial. "Who told you about this meeting?" Linda Stanhope asked. Her voice was sharp enough to cut wire. Trenton loosened his grip on his briefcase. He tried for composure. It did not quite hold. "It's a small town, Linda. I came because this involves my family, my grandfather. I have a right to be here." Ed Burney leaned forward on his crate. "Your grandfather had no right to take our money, but he did." Trenton set his briefcase on the floor. He straightened his back. "My grandfather was a man of God. He served this community for 37 years. He baptized your children. He buried your parents. Whatever you think these papers show, they show a thief," Martha Devane said. She had stopped crying. Her voice was the steadiest thing in the room. "They show a thief who smiled at us every Sunday while he stole what little we had. Sit down and look at them, Trenton, or leave." Trenton did not sit. His voice hardened. "Every person in this room should know that my attorney has already issued a cease and desist. Those documents are private family property, removed from an estate sale without authorization. Possessing them is actionable. Showing them to third parties is defamation per se. If any of you repeat what you've heard tonight, you will hear from Gerald Prescott individually." He scanned the room slowly, letting the threat settle on each face. "I am asking you, all of you, to consider very carefully what you are doing." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ed Burney, who had been leaning forward on his crate, leaned back and crossed his arms. Helen Goss stared straight at Trenton without blinking. Burl watched Trenton's face. The man was a lawyer. He knew how to control a room. But this was not a courtroom. This was a workshop full of people who had lost something they could not get back. And their grief was heavier than any argument he could make. Burl pointed to the ledger. "Sit down and read it. Just read it. Then say all that again if you still can." Trenton did not sit, but he stepped forward. He picked up the composition notebook and opened it. He turned pages.
His eyes moved down the columns, left to right, left to right. Anyone who could do basic subtraction would see it. He picked up the airmail letter, read it, set it down. Picked up the land trust documents, read the names, read the acreages, read the dates. The wall clock above the workbench ticked. Outside, a barn owl called once from the dark pines along the creek. Trenton set the documents down. He stood very still. When he spoke, his voice had changed. It was no longer a lawyer's voice. It was something rawer, something closer to the sound a person makes when the floor gives way beneath them. Trenton's hands hung at his sides. "What do you want?" Burl looked at him. "The land goes back. Every acre your grandfather bought with money that was not his. Every parcel, every deed. And Agnes Murdoch gets hers first." Trenton's jaw tightened. For a moment, the lawyer came back. The posture, the calculation, the reflex of a man trained to fight rather than fold. "You're talking about dissolving a trust that has been on the books for over 50 years. My attorney will have something to say about that." Burl folded his arms. "Your attorney already sent me a letter.
I read it. I put it in the piano." Ed Burney stood up from his crate. "The statute of limitations." Burl unfolded his arms. He had spent 2 evenings at the Litchfield Library reading Connecticut case law, and one sentence had stayed with him. "Doesn't apply. For fraud, the clock doesn't start when the crime is committed. It starts when the fraud is discovered. That is what the law calls tolling. We discovered it 3 weeks ago. The clock just started." The room turned back to Trenton. 11 faces, 11 families. 30 years of silence pressing down on one man. Trenton looked at the faces around the room, then at the piano, then at the notebook lying open on the plywood. He picked up his briefcase, held it at his side, and walked out without another word. The door banged shut behind him. The cold air lingered. Martha Devane turned to Burl. "Will he fight this?" Burl looked at her steadily. "He might, but the numbers are on our side, and numbers don't lose their nerve." The week after the meeting in the workshop, Trenton Hubbard did not return calls. Not Burl's, not anyone's. His secretary told Ed Burney that Mr. Hubbard was taking personal time. The town talked, because that is what towns do. By kitchen table, by post office, by the counter at Ray's Diner, where men in John Deere caps drank coffee and discussed the failures of their neighbors with the detachment of people who knew their own turn would come. Burl waited. He had learned patience from pianos. You did not rush a restoration. You set the glue and let it cure. You stretched the wire and let it settle. You tuned the pin and came back the next day to tune it again because new strings always drift. On the 5th day, a second letter arrived from Gerald Prescott.
This one was sharper. It accused Burl of defamation, threatened a lawsuit for intentional infliction of emotional distress against the Hubbard family, and demanded that all 11 attendees of the workshop meeting sign non-disclosure agreements or face individual legal action. Prescott had included a draft complaint, 42 pages, naming Burl as lead defendant. Burl read the complaint at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before he reached page 10. Then he drove to the Litchfield Library and spent the afternoon in the reference room, pulling Connecticut general statutes and making notes in his careful handwriting. He was not a lawyer, but he could read, and he could add, and he had the patience of a man who tuned pianos for a living. On the 7th day, Ed Burney called. His nephew was a paralegal in Waterbury and had agreed to review the documents pro bono. The nephew's assessment was 1 paragraph long. The Prescott letters are bluster.
"You have evidence of systematic fraud. Under Connecticut law, fraud tolling means the statute of limitations runs from discovery, not commission. They cannot intimidate you into silence when you hold the proof." Burl pinned the paragraph to the corkboard above his kitchen telephone. On the 9th day, Trenton called. Trenton's voice was flat, emptied out, the voice of a man who had spent 9 days arguing with himself and lost. "I'd like to meet. Your place. Just us." Burl looked out the window at the darkening hills. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Trenton arrived at 5 minutes past 8 in a Jeep Cherokee, not the polished sedan he usually drove. He wore no blazer, no tie. He looked like he had not slept well in some time, and Burl recognized the look because he had worn it himself after finding the documents, and again after Ellen died. The look of a person whose understanding of the world had been rearranged while they were not ready. They sat at Burl's kitchen table.
Burl poured coffee into 2 mugs, the blue one for himself, the white one with the chipped handle for Trenton. Ellen had always given the chipped mug to guests, saying it made them feel at home. Burl had never understood the logic, but he kept the practice. "I fired Prescott," Trenton said. He held the mug in both hands, but did not drink. "Yesterday. Told him I didn't need a guard dog. I needed a mirror." Burl waited. "I went through my grandfather's personal files," Trenton continued. "He kept copies, not everything, but enough. Enough to confirm what your notebook shows." "So you know it's true?" "I know it's true." The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a cardinal landed on the feeder Ellen had hung from the porch eave and sang 2 notes before flying away. My grandmother knew, Trenton said. Mildred. She kept the books. She signed the receipts. She must have known from the beginning. He paused.
I found a note in my grandfather's files, not addressed to anyone, just a reminder to himself. It said, M signed every page. If she talks, the books talk back. He kept that ledger as a leash on his own wife, Burl, and after she died, he could not bring himself to destroy it, so he hid it in the piano. Trenton stared into his coffee. I grew up thinking they were saints, both of them. My parents talked about them like they were, I don't know, like they were better than the rest of us. And now I'm sitting in your kitchen looking at proof that my grandfather was a common thief who used God as a bag to carry the money. Burl said nothing for a while. He understood what it cost a man to say that about his own blood. He had seen pride in Trenton's face at the memorial service years ago. Genuine pride. The kind that shapes a person's whole sense of who they are. Losing that was not small. Burl turned his coffee mug slowly on the table. Your grandfather did what he did.
You didn't do it. But those families lost what they lost, and the land is still in the trust. That part you can fix. Trenton nodded slowly. I called the district attorney's office yesterday. I told them everything. I'm cooperating. Voluntarily. Full disclosure. Burl set down his coffee. That took courage. The ghost of a smile crossed Trenton's face. The first honest expression Burl had seen from the man. It took my wife threatening to leave me if I didn't. She told me she married Trenton Hubbard, not Wendell Hubbard. And if I covered for a dead man's sins, she'd make me a dead man too. He shook his head. Funny how it takes a woman to tell you what you already know. What followed took 3 months and changed the shape of the county. The district attorney reviewed Burl's evidence and Trenton's records and determined that while a dead man could not be prosecuted, the Hubbard Heritage Land Trust had been built on systematic fraud.
The land purchases were voidable under Connecticut probate law. The DA's office confirmed what Ed Burney's nephew had written. Under the discovery rule, the statute of limitations for fraud begins when the injured party discovers the fraud, not when the fraud was committed. The clock had started the night Burl opened the false bottom of the Steinway. The DA filed a civil action, and the probate court in Litchfield scheduled hearings. Trenton cooperated at every step. He provided the trust's complete financial records. He identified the straw buyers. He signed affidavits and testified in probate court with the same flat voice he had brought to Burl's kitchen, laying out his grandfather's scheme in language that was precise and somehow more damning for its calm. Judge Harold Kenyon reviewed the case for 6 weeks. On a Tuesday morning in February, in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and radiator heat, he issued his ruling. The trust was dissolved.
7 parcels, totaling 218 acres, were ordered returned to the families whose tithes had purchased them. Tax liens cleared. New deeds issued. Agnes Murdoch's parcel, 41 acres bordering Whippoorwill Creek, was recorded first. The judge removed his glasses. No sentence can reach a dead man, he said, but the record can be corrected, and today it is. The gavel came down. It was not vengeance, it was arithmetic. The right numbers in the right columns at last. Millbrook Congregational issued a public apology. Osterhaus read it from the pulpit to a half-empty sanctuary. The apology used the word regret 4 times without once using the word sorry. Burl did not attend. Ed Burney told him about it at the diner. Ed stirred his coffee and shook his head. It sounded like a man trying to apologize for stepping on your foot while he's still standing on it. Burl almost smiled. Trenton resigned from his law practice. He sold the Talcott farmhouse and donated the proceeds to the affected families. He wrote one letter to the Litchfield County Register. My grandfather betrayed your trust. I cannot undo what he did. I can only stop benefiting from it. Some called Burl a hero. Others called him a troublemaker who dug up a dead man's sins. Burl did not care what they called him. He had done it because the numbers did not match, and a man who tunes pianos for a living cannot walk away from a wrong note. He finished restoring the Steinway in April, replaced every hammer with German-made Abel felt, restrung all 88 notes with Roslau wire, tuning each string by ear the way he always did, because a machine could tell you if a note was correct, but only an ear could tell you if it was right. He repaired the veneer, replaced the missing ivories, rebuilt the action until every key responded true. The piano played beautifully, better than it had in 50 years. Maybe better than it ever had, because now there was nothing hidden inside it. He donated the Steinway to the Briarwood Assisted Living Facility, drove it there himself in his Ford. A staff member named Luis helped him carry it into the common room near the window where the afternoon light came in. Burl drove to Briarwood a second time on a Saturday morning, carrying a manila envelope. He signed in at the desk, walked down the hallway, and found Agnes in the sunroom where she always sat. Hands folded, clouded eyes turned toward the window she could no longer see through. He pulled a chair beside her and placed the envelope in her lap. Burl placed his hand over hers. "Agnes, this is the deed to your land. 41 acres. It's yours again." Agnes did not open the envelope. She could not have read it if she had. But her fingers traced the edges of the paper inside, moving along the fold with the careful attention of someone touching something precious.
Her lips pressed together hard, the way they do when a person is trying not to cry and knows they will anyway. She lifted the envelope with both hands and held it against her chest. Not like a document, like a letter from someone she had lost. "Clayton knew," she whispered. "He always knew something was wrong." Burl nodded. "He did. He wrote it down." "He was a good man, Burl." "He was the best man I knew." Agnes held the deed and did not let go. The sunroom was warm and the light came in soft through the windows, and somewhere down the hallway, a staff member was playing a hymn on a piano that used to belong to a thief and now belonged to everyone. Burl squeezed her hand once, then stood and walked out. The parking lot was nearly empty. His Ford sat under a bare maple, the only truck in the lot. The sky was the color of old pewter, that gray Connecticut sky that sits on the hills from November to April and makes you earn every scrap of beauty the state gives you the rest of the year.
He opened the truck door but did not get in. He stood with one hand on the roof, looking out across the parking lot at the distant hills where stone walls crossed fields no one farmed anymore. The walls were still there though, 200 years old, built by men who moved rocks by hand because the work needed doing and no one else was going to do it. Clayton Murdoch at the kitchen table, counting bills by lamplight, folding them carefully, placing them in an envelope marked Africa Mission in his careful handwriting, doing his part, believing it mattered. A pastor smiling from the pulpit, a notebook with 2 columns, a letter that never got sent, and a piano that kept its secret for 40 years until a stubborn old man with a screwdriver pried it loose. Ellen. That September evening on the porch, the maples turning, her voice. You find one wrong note and you can't let it go. He took a breath. The air was cold and smelled of dead leaves and the first faint promise of snow. He got in the truck. He did not start the engine. He just sat, both hands on the wheel, looking through the windshield at the empty lot and the gray sky and the hills beyond. A single leaf blew across the windshield, tumbled once, and disappeared. The parking lot was quiet. The afternoon was still. Burl Hensley sat in his truck and listened to the silence, the good kind, the kind that comes after the last note has been played and the sound has gone out into the world, and there is nothing left to do but let it ring. Sources: 1. Steinway & Sons Piano History and Serial Numbers, https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/Steinway_%26_Sons 2. Litchfield County, Connecticut, https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/Litchfield_county_Connecticut. 3. Connecticut Probate Courts, https://www.ctprobate.gov/4. Estate Sale Practices in New England, https://portal.ct.gov/dcp/trade-practices-division/consumer-resources. 5.
Church embezzlement and nonprofit fraud statistics, https://www.justice.gov/criminal-fraud6. Connecticut Land Records and Property Law, https://portal.ct.gov/sots/landrecords. 7. History of Dairy Farming in Connecticut, https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/agriculture_in_Connecticut. 8. Piano restoration and action rebuilding, https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/piano_tuning. 9. Congregational churches in New England, https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/congregational_church. 10. Macular degeneration and vision loss, https://www.nih.eye-health/i-related-macular-degeneration. 11. Connecticut Statute of Limitations for Fraud, https://www.cga.ct.gov/current/pub/titles.htm.